This week on the Eldritch Lorecast, we're discussing predictions for 5.5 and 6th edition and whether or not you need a grid for grid-based combat, or it's better to do everything theatre of the mind, or can you do both, as well as advice for running your own one-shot, all that and more right now. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the number one podcast in all of Drakkenheim. That's right. The Lorecast spreads like the haze through Drakkenheim, causing all sorts of mutations and horribleness to happen, but you're euphoric. It's a really fun time, so you don't notice that you're growing gills and extra scales and all those things. My name is Ben Byrne, and I am here, as always, with James Hake, Shawn Merwin, and welcome back, Dael Kingsmill, to this episode of the podcast. Dael, first of all, a public Eldritch Lorecast happy birthday to you for the weekend.
Thank you very much.
And second of all, what is your go-to one-shot? Whether you're introducing new adventurers or you just need something for the weekend, what's the adventure that you've run a couple of times that you're like, this is a great one-shot?
My go-to is, and you know that you've got one when it does come to mind immediately. My go-to is actually a Pathfinder adventure called Hollow's Last Hope, which I, at some point in my DMing journey, I sort of converted a little bit to be more 5e friendly. I kind of condensed the story to be sort of more of one thread. It's a little bit branching in its existing form. And I just think it's really handy and really fun and, covers some riddles, covers some combat. It's got a good little spread of stuff to do. I think it's cool. But I am also currently on the lookout for a new go-to one-shot. So I'm keeping my ears peeled. My ears peeled? Sure.
If you have a go-to one-shot to suggest, leave it in the Twitch chat if you're watching
Please
this on
do.
Twitch, or on the YouTube comments on our new YouTube channel.
Dael, I've got a go-to one-shot to suggest.
Please do.
So this one is also a 5e conversion, so some assembly required. But one of the best one-shots I've ever had DM'd for me that convinced me to take it apart, put it into 5e and run with it is from Green Ronin's Dragon Age RPG. And it's from a collection of adventures that I believe is called Tales from Thedas. I'm not 100% on this, but the adventure itself is called The Amber Rage, and it's set in the marshes of Ferelden. And basically this little village that you are in, it starts with a festival, which I think is very modern of it, sort of 15 years before its time or 10 years or whatever it's been. It was the first adventure I ever played that started in a festival. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I liked it so much. And basically, all of this jubilation is suddenly broken when a bunch of berserkers from the marshes come running in. They've got this disease that makes them all angry and feral. And even though you stave off the attack, a little pandemic occurs within this village, and the players are tasked with going into the marsh and getting a cure before the black haulers, the judges, come in and summarily execute everyone in town and put a stop to this disease.
Can I just say, my Hollow's Last Hope is also about a little outbreak of a pandemic in a town, and you have to go off into the dangerous forest to find a cure.
Well, maybe you can sort of steal some bits and bobs from it to like create the super version of this sort of adventure concept.
Do pandemics make for a good D&D adventure because they are like an existential threat facing a population that the player characters themselves are fundamentally immune to? I think in this one, in Dragon Age, the player characters get it also. Though I guess these days, most of the campaigns I start, I just sort of create a new thing from scratch because I have campaigns on the mind. But if I'm ever running a one-shot, then that is absolutely the go-to.
So I hate to do this, but I'm going to say something I wrote because I've probably run it 700 times. When I was writing the Adventures League adventures, every season they would have an adventure to kick everything off. And they would always be, they're one adventure, but they're made of 5 mini adventures that you can run in an hour each. So Treasures of the Broken Horde is the kickoff for the Against the Giants sort of season. of D&D and Adventurers League. The first adventure in that series I love running. The characters are going to be hired by this fancy, popular, like TV star of an adventurer. They're going to track down the treasure from the cultists who worship the dragons, and they got their treasure all taken away, and the dragons were all killed. So you go out and you find this super popular adventurer dead where you were supposed to meet her. And there's a trail leading away. So you follow the trail and you go to this cave. And basically what happens is you find one of the hordes of these dragon cultists. However, it was cursed. So all the monsters in there have been shrunken down to like 1/20th of their normal size. So you are first attacked by a swarm of shrunken goblins. So think of goblins, but this big, rat-sized, just swarming all over you and like
goblins.
pulling your nose hairs and trying to cut your straps of your armor and that sort of thing. Then you have to contend with a hill giant that has been turned into a hill giant the size of a goblin, who still thinks it's a hill giant. And you get to hopefully save his pet bear, who is now shrunk down to the size of a house cat. And you have to make some animal handling and nature checks to save this bear. But if you do, you now have a pet that is a bear the size of a house cat, whose name is Blood Drinker. So,
I'm so happy.
That's how you hit them. 1 hour, boom, you get this experience. And then you can go to the other locations where these other hordes have been kept and deal with all of this strangeness. But if I'm going to sit down and somebody wants to learn the game, I give them a pre-gen and we do this. And it's very evocative and you can have lots of fun with the different, you're shrunk down, and it's pretty cool and easy to run. So that's what I go with.
Me and my party were very nearly massacred by giant badgers in one of the other bits of that adventure.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Ruthless, those badgers.
Mm-hmm.
I've never run it or played it, but I have heard, like, as you're describing it, I'm like, yeah, that's familiar. Someone has definitely spoken highly of that to me before.
Look, this is the first time I'm hearing about it, and I love it. And I immediately assembled a team of players in my head that I want to run it for.
Speaking of things that are near perfect, if I don't say so myself, though mind you, I didn't work on this. Dungeons of Drakkenheim, or should I say Sebastian Crowe's Guide to Drakkenheim, is the latest Kickstarter from Ghostfire Gaming. It launched less than 12 hours ago from when we're recording, and already has reached almost 400,000 pledged amount with over 2,600 backers so far. This is just like a warm hug from the Dungeon Dudes community. They do awesome work. I've read through parts of Dungeons of Drakkenheim. I very much almost ran that for my player group recently. They just do amazing work, and watching it tick up to funded in less than 3 minutes, which I believe is a Ghostfire record, and then reach 100,000 within half an hour was really, really just wonderful from the community. And you could see, I was in a chat with the dudes at the time. You could just see them like going, so embraced by their community and really enjoying being in their Discord and chatting with everyone. Shawn, you were also there, maybe not when it launched, but beforehand. And we're talking about the love for Dungeons of Drakkenheim as a sort of D&D adventure world beforehand. Did you want to talk a little bit about what you said last night? Because I thought that was really lovely too.
Yeah, there was a thread on EN World where they do these threads every once in a while. They call them survivor threads. And they'll take about 20 things, and it's not a review. It's not anything, objective. It's just subjectively, you can upvote and downvote one thing on the list. And you can just go back every day, once per day, and do that. And then we see who is the last one standing. They did one for $1 million Kickstarters over the last few years, or RPG Kickstarters. And of the $20 million plus Kickstarters that were on the list, Ghostfire projects, there were 3 of them. We all came in at least the top 9. and Dungeons of Drakkenheim was in the top 3. And I think it just goes to show that the Dungeon Dudes have a great brand. They're great people. They give to their communities things that their community wants, whether that's in terms of a live stream play or in terms of advice. And so that gets them a lot of love in their community. They used Forged with Ghostfire, which is what we provide. And that gave them an even bigger platform and people that may not have known their stream. And then it becomes a recurring loop of, okay, now I'll go watch them. Ooh, these are great. People talk about them. Then they get more product. We deliver a pretty good product on behalf of the Dungeon Dudes. And it's a loop that keeps going. And I think the Dungeon Dudes have given a lot. The class I teach, I ask people at the beginning of class, what do you watch? How do you get your news, or how do you get your DM advice or player advice? And Dungeon Dudes always come up, at least by a couple people. So I know that means that they are putting out content that is valuable for people.
Dael and James, have you explored Drakkenheim much, even cursorily?
Drakkenheim I'm not too familiar with, but the Dungeon Dudes are absolutely fantastic people. I've watched a handful of their videos. I don't watch GM advice videos very much anymore, just because I'm content with where my GMing is right now. But just to get a sense of who they were, I watched a handful of them, and I was impressed by the quality of the advice, and more than that, the quality of just how shall I say it, the rapport that they have with one another. It's a very good team that they've got going on. And that was really clear when they wrote for Fables back in our original Fable in Citadel of the Unseen Sun. They tackled the final episode of that Fable. And I guess minor spoilers, but they infuse some fun genre bending stuff into that episode. And you can tell that they have this sort of personal stamp. That infused a little bit of what I think of that sort of Drakkenheim flavor, right? Because Drakkenheim has that sort of sci-fi-ish bent to it as well, even though it's in a dark fantasy genre. And you can tell that they just love what they do. They love the medium they work in, the genre they work in. They love doing it.
Absolutely lovely dudes. And in fact, you can see them. They were on the podcast, I think, 2-3 weeks ago.
Yeah, not long ago.
I put a link, if you're listening to this on YouTube, up there. I think I'm pointing in the right direction.
There's always that moment.
Which way am I pointing? Yeah. Is it that? It's always the opposite of what you think. But the new book, including, I think, the big draw of this one, and I am excited to delve into this a little bit more, is the Apothecary class, which is an intelligence-based spellcaster, but really drawing on that, investigator, Gothic horror, Victorian Gothic. There's a Jekyll and Hyde subclass for it. There's a Frankenstein style subclass for it. Really focusing on that dark fantasy, grounded style of spellcasting, which I think, dare I say, that the Apothecary may be what I had hoped for the Artificer on some level. The Artificer was very cool in its own right, and you can play Tony Stark, but it does feel a little bit like high fantasy, like it's like up here. Everything about it is just like, it just happens because, you have your tools and you touch it to something and then it's magical 5 minutes later. And it's like, all right, well, that's well and good, but I don't really feel like I'm tinkering. I want to feel like I'm getting my hands dirty when I make something and bringing a corpse back to life. There's no way to dirty your hands better.
We just got a notification through our company channels from Phil, one of our producers, our main TTRPG producer, and he just let us know that today is now officially our best first day of a Kickstarter ever in Ghostfire history. So, Hey, Dungeon Dudes. Good work. And hey, Ghostfire Marketing, all the lovely people who work behind the scenes and the people who supported all of this.
Yeah,
amazing.
Absolutely. Quick shout out to Ona Christensen, who's the art director for Sebastian Crowe's Guide to Drakkenheim, Martin Hughes, who does the layouts, Matt Domino, who's an illustrator who has helped working on Sebastian Crowe's, Simon who we have a running gag in the office that Simon is the hardest working out of everybody in the company. So big shout out to Simon and of course the Dungeon Dudes team as well. Super exciting. They are streaming. I know it's probably not kosher to send people to another stream while we're still in the middle of one. But I believe they're streaming on their YouTube channel right now, giving a bit more information, delving into the book a little bit deeper. So if you want more information, you can go check that out. We will, of course, be on YouTube ourselves on Wednesday.
So you can have your cake and eat it too. You can go to that stream if you want to right now and then watch us on VOD.
Yeah, go mute this stream, but leave the window open.
But leave it running.
Yeah, exactly. No. That was implicit. That was implied. You never close the stream. That would just be rude. Speaking of not being rude, actually, you know what? We're going to go off script a little bit here because James Hake brought my attention to something on Twitter just before we recorded, and I had to go find the link again. James, do you want to walk us through this? What this tidbit? Again, we're getting these morsels, but they're so fascinating and fun to talk about.
Certainly. Sly Flourish, Mike Shea, who is a wonderful person whom Shawn and I have both worked with before, posted at Ray Winninger, presented to you with humility, a link to a Sly Flourish blog post. It says, "What I'd love from the next iteration of D&D." And we'll go into what exactly is in there in a moment. But Ray Winninger, who, if you don't know, is the, I'm going to mess this title up, but essentially the head of development, game development over at Wizards of the Coast for D&D, quote retweets and says, "I think you're going to be pleased." Which, one, leads me to believe there's going to be some big, exciting news at this much hyped, big, exciting D&D sort of symposium that Wizards got planned in the immediate future that they've been talking about. But let's take a look at what Sly Flourish, Mike Shea, says in this article, what I'd love from the next iteration of D&D. One, that it's fully backwards compatible. If an adventure calls for a veteran stat block, he wants a compatible veteran coming out of the new monster manual and knowing that it works just fine. I think that's a good thing to ask for. Easier encounter building, the oft-cited bugbear of 5th edition that encounter math is impenetrable and that even Wizards does not use the encounter math that's in the DMG. Also, I think a safe ask from basically everyone who's running 5e right now. Include Theater of the Mind guidelines for combat. I think this is a pretty interesting one. Both the DMG and Xanathar's includes pages and pages of optional rules for gridded play and hardly any guidelines for running games in Theater of the Mind or an abstract map combat. I think we can turn to games like Fate or other ones that are built without a map in mind for how to run combats without using 5-foot squares literally represented on a grid. But if D&D wants to tout Theater of the Mind play as one of its core means of running combat, then going to another game's game master book does not seem like the most straightforward way of doing that. And an alternative option to gridded play, not a replacement. I talk about modularity in 5e all the time as being something that I want, and this like the big module. Strength and high CR monsters. This is an axe to grind that Mike talks about a lot. The high CR monsters, in his opinion, are a little bit of a wet noodle when it comes to their offensive capabilities against high CR, against high level players. Fix certain spells and abilities that just kind of instantly win combats. Thing like Banish, Polymorph, Hero's Feast. Messy ones like Conjure Animals, which will summon 8 wolves in the midst of a combat and just like drag everything to a molasses slow pace. And a handful of other things. Include the upgrades that Tasha's has made, provide less problematic descriptions for races, which a number of products, including our Aurora campaign setting, have taken a look at, and update the OGL to include the new edition and leave everything else the heck alone. That's everything that Mike has called for. And to hear Ray say, "we'll be excited," seems to suggest that even some, maybe even a majority of what Mike is calling for in this document will be deeply, closely assessed in the upgrade to the next edition. All of those things sound like no-brainers to me. And it makes me happy to hear that.
Yeah.
Oh, He did a head tilt. It wasn't even the arms cross.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know if I agree that they would seem like no-brainers, probably to a fan base. I'm not sure from the other. And to be honest, James, you and Shawn especially would have more experience than I in that specific field, from a more industry perspective about these sort of things. Because, I look at Theatre of the Mind guidelines for combat, and my more cynical brain turns on. First of all, if they're about to announce a VTT for D&D Beyond or D&D in general, which was one of the speculations we made last week about Wizards Presents, it would seem, it's sort of what they tried to do with 4E, really push gridded combat, really push that VTT. If you're not playing on the VTT, you're not playing D&D. And I don't think they'll go that hard at it. But my more cynical brain does wonder if support for Theatre of the Mind is like half a page or a page in the DMG that just kind of says like, oh yeah, you could do it this way. I
think it's a really good point. And I might be 10 years in the past, because the early phases of 5th edition really heavily emphasized Theatre of the Mind as an option. It just never really gave hard tools to use it.
What I always think is really interesting when it comes to Theatre of the Mind and the support that is built into the game for it is that, I do sort of read the 5th edition player's handbook or DMG as it exists and go, yeah, okay, there is clearly some love here for Theatre of the Mind, the way that they talk about combat. But then in every other aspect of the book, when you're talking about classes, when you're talking about spells, you suddenly lose the language that supports Theatre of the Mind. Suddenly it is very intricately interwoven with, feet distance and, it's 20-foot radius. You can cast it at a point centered 30 feet away from you. It all gets very tricky to keep in your head if you're doing Theatre of the Mind. So it's one of those things where I do think that it was an intended thing for Theatre of the Mind to be core to the game. But once you move a little bit further away from talking about combat, it starts to kind of get lost in the source.
And yet, when you look at the state of D&D when 5e was published, it seemed like a great step in the opposite direction from what 4th edition did, in which all distances were measured in squares for effects like that. And so suddenly having it be, yes, we're going to say 30 feet instead of 6 squares. It's like, wow, we're back to measuring in feet. This is an incredible change. Mm-hmm. But no, it certainly isn't Theatre of the Mind forward.
When you have one of your character race traits be, you can move 35 feet instead of 30 feet, you are almost immediately saying Theatre of the Mind is not how we expect you to play the game, because we're measuring everything in 5-foot increments. And I don't think it wouldn't be terribly difficult to give some guidelines for, if I'm playing Theatre of the Mind and the wizard casts a fireball on the group, how should we do that? What are some ways we can do that? Even giving some ideas about running a game narratively. I try not to think as Theatre of the Mind as a tactical option, but as a narrative option. I think if the game designers went at it in that way, let's play narratively rather than grid based. You can come at it from a different direction, and you can make a slightly different game without having to write a completely different game. And that's what I would like to see. That's sort of the advice on. It's easy to say, don't worry about distances. You can shoot your bow if you can see your enemy. Great. It's when you get to those, as Dael was talking about, the spells that are so intricately described in feet and positioning. That's where you need the advice of a game designer who has thought about it for more than a week to say, how do we service this narrative-based fan base and make a good game, maybe a great game for them, while still giving them concrete rules to fall back on?
It hurts my brain to think about threading the needle or threading the bridge, as it were, around creating a game that serves both the kind of narrative needs of people who want to play the game narratively and the people who enjoy combat as a tactical wargamey style sort of thing. And I think that D&D and I think Mike even says in this article that changing too much about D&D makes it not D&D anymore. I feel like getting too far away from the tactical wargamey combat takes it away from being D&D, but I think also getting too far into that takes it away from being D&D. It kind of exists in this nebulous in-between. I sort of threw this out last week, although I can't remember if we drilled down on it, so I apologize if this is a slight repeat. Do we see the potential for like advanced 5e or like a version of 5 or a kind of splitting where there's like, here are the simple rules or here are the rules to get started and they are the more narrative based rules and they really lean into theater of the mind, and here is all these modular, like if you want to treat the combat like a war game, like a Pokemon battle, and it goes diddly 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 diddly, and then you're like on a grid suddenly. Here are those rules kind of almost separate that kind of latch on to the simpler rules. Can we see the game being kind of split apart that much?
I think I could imagine that. I can't remember if I said this last week because I do remember us briefly touching on it. But on Twitter lately, there's been a set of threads, I don't recall who, that has been analyzing sales data from D&D in the 80s and 90s. And one of them really marks the marked lower sales of advanced Dungeons and Dragons versus basic Dungeons and Dragons, and how even though that advanced in AD&D was something of a status symbol, it wasn't even really much of a comment on the relative complexity of the rules. But the idea that this game was somehow more advanced than the other D&D, which is already reasonably complex in its own right, really scared people off. Is I think a conclusion to draw from that. And I can't imagine Wizards doing something that mirrors that decision these days, especially because they seem to kind of want to unify 5e in a big way.
Here's another question I had, looking at Mike Shea's list, which was like fix certain spells and abilities. And someone who has come in at 5e or come in at 5e's level, I've just kind of taken it for granted.
Sorry, Ben, I don't want to interrupt you. Someone in chat says, I don't seem to be much of a fan of tactical wargame D&D. My favorite video game series is Fire Emblem. Miss me with that. I love tactical wargame D&D. I want to set the record straight there. I love when D&D gets tactical. And I love a nice balance of role play and tactics in my D&D play. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I largely agree with you. And like Shawn was saying, it is hard with the class abilities. I know I played Theater of the Mind in a pub because we didn't have room for a grid or a battle map or anything. And one character was playing a rogue, and he was he didn't realize he was struggling with the class and the class's abilities until somebody bought in a little whiteboard that was only yay big, about 15 centimeters by 30 centimeters, something like that, if you use the metric system. And it had
Good luck, Americans.
Yeah, figure that one out. And it had little squares on it, so we could basically, it was still fundamentally theater of the mind, but it was like, this is exactly where you are, and this is where the enemy is, and this is the distance between. And it just unlocked the class for him. He was like, oh, I understand what I need to do now. I need to get over here because, okay, and just the movement seems to become so much more important.
Yeah, I was going to say, I read someone, it might have even been in the comments on last week's Lorecast, that was saying there are some classes that are just hurt more by theater of the mind, and Rogue is one of them. And I'd just never thought of that before. But it really is true because it is such a tactical class. It requires thinking about your placement so carefully, even if you're not dealing with flanking rules or things like that. You're still having to think about line of sight, whether you're hidden, all of these different little things that have to do with sneak attack, whether you get your dash as a rogue action, all these little things that are much more in play if you're playing on a grid compared to if you're playing in the mind. But it also makes me think of this interesting juxtaposition that does happen between, like James was saying, I like role play and I like tactics, right? And it made me think of, and I'm going to try to thread this bridge without hitting any spoilers, but in a recent episode of Critical Role, of course, there was a combat that broke out, but it was in a very interesting kind of dramatic role play moment. And it was interesting to me to note this difference between when combat in Critical Role goes to the grid and when it doesn't, because it was this choice of this is a combat, yes, but it is also a heavy role play moment. So we're just going to keep it up here, kind of in our brains, and see how we go with it.
When Matt's prepared a diorama or not, helps.
Are we likely to die today?
I've been playing a lot of online chess recently just to like fill little 15-minute gaps in my workday. And I'm not a very good chess player. I can't think 10 moves ahead in the way that like grandmasters do. I don't have the book of chess plays memorized. But one of the things that strikes me about tactical grid play in chess that is also very similar to tactical grid play in D&D, for me at least, is that it's most fun when you're in a position where you're not just committed to one thing. Let me explain what I mean by that. Your comment about rogues and sneak attack and positioning made me think of this. One of the things that really makes rogues explosive is the way that sneak attack works, and how someone can be doing one thing and also giving you sneak attack, maybe unintentionally. A fighter runs in to attack one enemy, and you suddenly gain sneak attack on a totally different enemy who happens to be within 5 feet of the fighter, just by virtue of them being in the position that they're in. It's like in chess when you move your knight into position and suddenly you've got an attack on both their king and their rook. You've forked them.
You forked them.
Yeah.
Forked them up.
And because they have to move the king, you get a free rook out of the exchange, right? It's you've done two things at once, and the rogue really excels in positions like that. And that's the meat of tactical play, because you've managed to think a couple of moves ahead and do all that. And theater of the mind, that's not what theater of the mind wants to do.
That's all that is very true. We also need to note, though, that by making it tactical play, you also do things like slow the game down and remove yourself from the narrative to focus specifically. No, don't stand there, stand here. And then 20 minutes pass as all 6 players at the table and the game master are all saying, well, if you stood here, then this, then this. Whereas you can make 5.5 as, assuming they put flanking back in, right? Flanking is an optional rule. I know that many, many people use it because it used to not be an optional rule. But if you remove flanking from the game, you can do everything to get a sneak attack that a rogue can do in Theater of the Mind. Is there someone standing next to your target? Yes, you can sneak attack. Are you hidden? Yes, you can sneak attack. That can be done just as easily in Theater of the Mind as it is tactically. Now, you might have 3 seconds to say, am I hidden? Roll a stealth check. Now, the next version of the game could just say, if you're playing Theater of the Mind, rather than trying to figure out where you are or where everyone else is on the board, use your bonus action to make a stealth check. Use your bonus action to make a deception check to trick your enemy into thinking you're going to stab him in the leg when you stab them in the chest. All of those things can very easily, with one die roll or even one roll, use your bonus action. You automatically will get sneak attack on your next attack. That can be done very quickly, very easily, and then the narrative comes to the fore rather than counting out your squares 37 times to make sure you're getting there in 6 moves instead of 7. Right. So it's a give and take on what people truly love about D&D. And if you truly love tactical combat, which I do, then great. we can make a game that works that way. I think we can also make a game that works the other way with just a little forethought and a little attention to that side of things. They've got some incredible game designers at Wizards of the Coast right now. I'm sure they can do it if they really, really want to.
I think, Shawn, you're right on the money about this. And I think it's exactly what Mike is asking for, is that he doesn't use these words exactly, but theater of the mind and tactical play have different implicit priorities. And the 5e rulebooks don't make those implicit priorities explicit to players and game masters. And that's where the tension comes from. That's where why isn't theater of the mind giving me the sort of juice that I want tactical play to do? And it's because it's not, it doesn't want to unless you really make it work. Now I want to hear what Ben has to say.
No, it's not a disagreement. If anything, it's an agreement. But I'm just like, threading that bridge is going to be fascinating, because now I'm like, how do you do that without writing two versions of the rules fundamentally, right? Because the other thing that tactical combat does in the current, or grid-based combat does in the current game is I think there's kind of a balancing effect on the rules, right? Like, I'm not just thinking of Rogue, but I'm also thinking of like the Paladin's aura. And it's like, well, in Theater of the Mind, can we all fit within the Paladin's aura? It's like, yeah, I guess so. I don't know. I don't see why not, or I'm not going to argue that you can't. But, but the party are all squished in one corner of the room. Whereas if you go onto the grid, it's like, no, you can't all fit in the Paladin's aura because the tunnel's this wide and it goes around a corner and there's boxes in the way and blah, 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 blah. With the rogue sneak attack, it's like, can I get into a position where I can hide? And it's like, well, no, like physically you can't. There's too many squares, or you put yourself out in the middle of the room and you can't get away to get around the corner to get yourself into a position where you can hide. Go ahead, Shawn.
So here's a simple solution to that Paladin problem, right? Rather than saying in the rules, your Paladin aura is 10 feet, everyone within 10 feet gets this bonus. Oh, you're now 15th level, everyone within 20 feet now has this bonus to saves. You change the rule by saying one creature you can see. Oh, you're higher level, 2 creatures you can see. Higher level, 3 creatures you can see. And now, is there some sort of godlike rule telling us that it's coming from the Paladin, so therefore it has to be distance related? No. So change the game slightly to make it work both ways.
Also note the interesting little sort of the subtle implicit change with that terminology that influences it in a slightly more roleplay direction. You have to choose which person. Which person are you protecting?
Who do you love more?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like where I was going is there a, again, to look at 5.5 or 6e in a modular way or potentially an advanced way, is there a version of the rules that's kind of like this more, theater of the mind dedicated kind of way, a way that is thought of specifically to be really applicable in theater of the mind, can be done on a grid just as easily, but really applicable to theater of the mind, making changes like instead of distance, it's, who can see what. And then like a supplement that drops, a year, 2 years later, that's like the war game manual of like, all right, this is how to do tactical combat if you want to do like a D&D, like a war game. And it's the Pokemon battle. Also, 8 Wolves sucks.
You don't want 8 wolves on your battlefield?
No, I don't like I played with a druid once, and they were 3rd or 4th level. I can't quite. Maybe they were 5th level. I can't remember
that lead in.
Point.
I played with a druid once. Okay, I have war flashbacks.
Just their go-to was hit the red button, 8 wolves, and this was before my realization that like the DM can technically choose what the animals are. In negotiation, I suppose, because it wouldn't have been 8 wolves every time. But just the culmination of this was there's a scene that I've run a couple times. I think it's actually from Horde of the Dragon Queen, but I've never read it. I've just like run it after having it run for me. But there's like a Dragonborn who comes to a keep and he's like, I demand a champion, come out and fight me. And it's a mano-a-mano match. And the intention is that this Dragonborn just monsters the party member. But it's like, you're just setting up your big bad for the next stretch of the campaign. Like, this dude is bad news and you should be scared of him. And the party are trying to decide who to send out. And I'd run this, a dozen times by this point. And they're like, all right, well, let's send out the fighter or the paladin. They're big, they're bulky. It'll be like, they'll be able to tank hits, blah, blah, blah. And the druid just goes, I wander out. And I'm like, oh, okay, the druid's going out. And I didn't see it coming. This was the worst bit, is I didn't see it coming. He just walks up and he's like, and I summon 8 wolves and run away. And I'm like, damn it!
It's me playing Elden Ring.
Yeah. I had assumed coming in at the 5th level, or the 5th edition level, I should say, that problematic spells were just going to be part of the game. Because, you need spells that do cool things, and some spells just by their very nature are going to be very powerful for specific circumstances. Banish is incredibly powerful, or Polymorph is incredibly powerful when you face the party with a single T-Rex to try and create a Jurassic Park moment. But it's not as powerful if they're facing a horde of velociraptors or skeletons or whatever it is, because you can only banish or polymorph one thing at a time, I think, at least in the base version of the spell. So I had kind of accepted that it was situational, yet very powerful. Is this wish of Mike Shea's possible? Is there a way to create spells that are fun to play that don't become problematic in specific situations?
This is a really interesting offshoot of the discussion we've been having about tactical versus narrative play. People love their big solo monsters, and typically that's from a narrative standpoint, because tactically they punch below their weight class because of D&D's sort of preference towards really strong single target removal, to use a Magic the Gathering term. D&D really lavishes its attention on Fireball, which is an area of effect spell. It gets a lot of individual creatures, but the applicability of AoE spells is really dependent on encounter design, right? How big is the arena? How spread out are the monsters? There's all of these mitigating factors that limit the power of AoE effects. Whereas really there's one thing that really throws a wrench in the gears of single target removal: legendary resistance. And that's a thing that, it's got its problems. Players tend to hate it unless they've kind of reckoned with it already, unless they're veteran enough to know that, oh yeah, the big monsters are just going to ignore our big stuff 3 times before we can handle it. And if they don't have legendary resistance, then and then I polymorph, or I banish, or I handle it in some similar way. Sickening Ray, or whatever the single target removal of that level tends to be.
I like to think about spells in terms of stories. Like, we're going to have a Conan movie. We're going to have some sort of fantasy movie. Is it cool when the party comes into this final combat and banish one of the monsters, the big bad guy? Is that fun for you as a viewer of the movie to watch? If the answer is no, then you probably don't want that spell in the game, because it's not going to be satisfying for everyone at the table, the game master and player alike. So, seeing a big fireball go off in a D&D movie and things get crisp, everyone would stand up and cheer. Seeing the big T-Rex turned into a mouse and then picked up by the tail might be funny, right? If it's the first combat of the movie where we see how magic works. But for the final encounter, would that be satisfying for viewers? If not, then why do you want it in your game? And sadly, the game has this bit of nostalgia with it that people are going to have a hard time getting over, the fact that there isn't a polymorph spell that you can polymorph the monster into something, and they will be all up in arms because it's not there, when maybe it doesn't belong there, because it's not a great story narrative tool.
There's something that Colville has talked about before, which P.S. shout out to Matt. Thanks for filling in for me last week. Thanks. There's something that Colville has talked about in terms of designing interesting encounters and interesting villains and monsters, saying that they should have different abilities to what are available to player characters. They work differently. They play by their own rules, and that genuinely does free up a lot of space in terms of how these kinds of things work, right? And I don't think that this is something that would ever be done, because there is a certain ethos when designing Dungeons and Dragons as a game where you want everyone at the table to be playing by the same rules. You want everyone to be on the same page playing by the same rules. And so they would never do this. But wouldn't it free up so much if there were some spells that are available to bad guys that aren't available to players? Something that you have to contend with, like banishment, as a player, that's like, oh no, like what a dramatic, cool moment to have one of the party members be banished. But if that was like relegated to bad guys until very high levels of the game, that I feel like that kind of thing makes for really cool, interesting encounter design, but it's not something that we are ever going to see in the rules as written.
So, Dael, I think it's interesting that you bring this up, the asymmetry of character design versus monster design, and I'm skeptical that Wizards would never allow that. I think they allow it all the time, actually. I think it's part of their core ethos right now, especially as they decide to remove spells largely from monster stat blocks and give them discrete abilities instead. However, there is a part of this that I do think you're right on the money of, and it's that I'm skeptical they would ever delineate spells between good guys can use them and bad guys can use them, because it feels un-D&D to me. If you look at the monster design in the monster manual, the NPCs, the mage and the archmage in particular, the mage, who is a CR6 enemy, designed for fighting 6th-level characters, is like an 11th level wizard, wildly outsized in terms of what character level they are, as opposed to what CR they fight. The archmage, who is a CR 9, I think, 11, something like that, is 11. Like a CR 18, a level 18 wizard. Yeah. Wild, huge amount of spells available to them. That CR 11 archmage has 9th level spells. It has time stop, for goodness sake. I would love to see more of that. Make banishment a 7th level spell or something like that, because I think it punches at that weight class for certain levels. Just keep doing what they've been doing of having the mage and the archmage have, very high level spells available to them compared to what the players would have at the level at which they're fighting them. I think that's a have your cake and eat it too moment for what you're talking about, Dael.
If Dante leaves that sound in, that was me eating cake.
Dante, you're contractually obligated.
Sorry, audio-only people that you had to deal with that.
We've talked about it now. It's got to be there.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of things that players have to deal with, we had 2 emails come in which had a pretty similar theme. If you want to email the podcast at ghostfiregaming.com, send us your questions and we shall to answer them, for it is our due in life. It is the devilish pact we made upon the crossroads. Yes, I will grant you the Eldritch Lorecast if you answer questions. And I was like, man, you sound like my grandma.
None of us can play the fiddle. Yeah.
Yeah, damn. Oh, well, questions it is, I suppose. These questions coming in from Cassia and Callum. And the reason I've sort of partnered these together is because Cassia is asking that they're running a one-shot. They're taking over for their forever game master for a single session. And I hope we're not too late on this question, actually, because they were basically asking, how do I run a one-shot in the canon of my game master's world, because the players want to play the same characters, because they're relatively new at the game, so they don't want to have to relearn, everything, without making things too difficult when my GM comes back into the GM's seat. I don't want to make any sweeping changes to their world, even something like, you encounter a dragon and the GM's like, oh, dragons don't exist in the world that I made. Okay, I get, that's my example, not theirs. But I just wanted to partner that quickly with Callum's question, who was basically asking what is the art of the one shot? How do you go about creating a one shot specifically as opposed to an ongoing campaign? Dael,
Well,
I see you have thoughts.
For starters, I'm with Callum. One shots are really hard. I find them really hard. But it's this ridiculous answer is that you do them a lot and you get better at them over time. Practice is good. But let me just give a couple of examples, right? I think that you shouldn't be worried about wrecking the campaign. I think that you would have to do a lot of work and prodding at the boundaries before you actually broke the regular DM's campaign. Don't chuck in a wish spell, I guess. No time travel, maybe. I feel like you have to really go at it hard before you sort of break the structure that is already in place. But I think that there are a lot of things that you can do. I read the email and you mentioned the idea of it was all a dream being really cheap. But think about what if you had a session where there was some kind of an imp that put you all under a spell and now you're having to actually find your way out of the dream. Actually explicitly in text, make it a dream episode. You could have a holiday episode. Those are always fun. Festivals, there's a
beach episode.
Yeah, a beach episode. Have these there's a concept philosophically called festival time, and it's the idea that the rules of reality are kind of suspended a little bit during the holidays, and you can sort of exploit that and have this sort of side reality just for this one festival and then come back to the main story. Do a haunted house episode where you're just, you're cordoned off in this little specific area solving this little specific problem. I think that you'll actually find that you can do a lot of things that are super fun, that are really centered on one problem to solve.
I want to grab this and run for just 30 seconds. I don't think what I have to say has so much meat on the bone that I need to talk for ages about it. But like things in RPGs that tamper with player agency, like body swap, body-mind swap, or, someone is possessed and does wild things, ways in which the characters act like not themselves usually feel like cheap punches for a DM to pull in an ongoing campaign. They're the episodes of Star Trek I like the least because I came here for these characters, damn it. I want to see them be themselves and not an alien possessing one of them. But for a side DM one shot, they're actually perfect because no one expects, real fidelity to the campaign in a major way because they already know that someone else is at the wheel. So if you have some kind of goofy stuff that you want to pull, then the sheer sort of like meta game of it all of, this isn't a regular DM is kind of enough to scrub away all of those, finagly little nitpicks anyway.
I've written way too many one shots in my life. So just a few tips. Use pre-gens if you can. If you can make some pre-gens that have an actual strong hook, strong connection, maybe some secret goals for the characters that are specifically talked about in the adventure, some traits that the characters might have, some tools that the characters might be given on their character sheet that are specifically addressed in the adventure that you write, you are going to make some people very happy because they get to do the cool things that you put on their character sheet. Stick with a linear plot, especially if you're on a time limit. Generally, if you're running a one-shot, you've got 3 or 4 hours and then we're done forever. So make it linear because if you have some free-range NPCs, you're never going to get to the end. And hopefully the end is something cool that you want them to see. So make it linear. You can make it so if they go to A or B, they can't go to B or A. Once they're done, they go directly to C. You can do stuff like that to give choice, but keep it on a pretty straight path, and keep it shorter than you think it should be. I think is very important because once you introduce the players to their characters and the characters to each other, you're going to quickly run out of time. And again, the end is usually the strength of your one shot. So make sure you get to the end and have time for denouement and so on.
Yeah, I ran a one shot for my mum and 2 of my siblings not that long ago, where I had already planned quite a linear adventure, And I tend to suspend my logic rules when I'm doing a one-shot a little bit. I like my traps to make sense, but if it's a one-shot, I'm just like, you know what? It's just a fun puzzle, and it doesn't matter. But I planned this fairly linear thing, and then my mum really wanted to interact with NPCs. So I suddenly ended up with 3 NPCs that were really detailed, and it took a bit of a different, detour in the middle there that took up a bunch of extra time. I had to cut some stuff. You will end up finding that you have to prepare something much shorter than what you are actually intending to run. By the way, just a fun little tidbit at the end of that session, my mum, the like finale was that there was this character, this sort of arrogant adventurer character who was very rich, and the player characters had defeated the dragon, and this guy showed up and wanted his cut of the treasure. And my mum, I suspended the rules a little bit again. My mum basically charmed him into thinking that he should go in under this frozen lake to get the treasure. She convinced him that that's where the treasure was and he should go and get it. And he drowned. My mum fully made an evil cleric PC for her first ever character. And she played it to a T. And I was so proud.
Well done, Dael's mom. Hope you're watching this.
Dael's mum, the new sort of ethereal mascot of the podcast, just this kind of like off-screen character.
Now,
an angelic presence watching out for us. Anytime.
Yeah. Please, James, write that. The warlock. We could, what we actually, all right, dead set. We need a Dael adventure setting, right? Like campaign setting. And it's like Warlock of Dael's mum, Warlock of the Gentleman. They're just the 2 starting places that I can see.
Dael's Dael, yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. There you go.
Yes.
Perfect. Let's make it happen. The next Forged with Ghostfire. Well, that is about all we have time for today. If you want to email the podcast and ask us questions, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. If you are watching this on YouTube, you are watching it on our shiny new YouTube channel, which is currently dedicated entirely to the Eldritch Lorecast. So consider subscribing. Make the Eldritch Lorecast feel the love from you, whoever you are, and be back next week, because we will be back next week with another episode. My name is Ben Byrne here, as always, with Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, and until next week, play some more D&D. I don't know. I feel like we need an outro moniker. I don't know what it would be, but
who's Monica?
Bum, 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 bum. And that's the outro.
Good. Not silly. Not
we
silly
are
at all.
professionals, folks. We are professionals.